The Amiga, remember that thing? It was a bloody great big 80s computer. Sometimes people played games on them, and a lot of those games were very good. Unfortunately for all the Amiga's 16-bit grunt, it suffered from one major problem: loading times. Turns out loading games off a 3.5-inch floppy disk can often take a bit of time, so what alternatives do you have? Enter the Mega Drive. While the machine isn't identical to Commodore's 16-bit powerhouse, Amiga games often found themselves being ported to the machine thanks to obvious similarities. Today we're going to take a look at one such Amiga to Mega Drive port, and we're going to start with Amiga's flagship graphics showcase, Shadow the Beast. Shadow the Beast is famous for a lot of things, but two things in particular always come up in conversation: the game's beautiful atmospheric soundtrack by David Whittaker, and its rather impressive 12 layers of parallax scrolling background imagery. Shadow the Beast is quite the looker even in this day and age, and the game's iconic soundtrack even got re-recorded in a proper recording studio for a re-release on the first Immortal CD released back in 1999. No, not Immortal, the metal band. If you're unfamiliar with the game, then the basic mechanics are that of an action game. As Arbron, you must traverse the game's world and hunt down Malatoth, who has killed your father. It's up to you to defeat his evil minions and progress through the game's many diverse areas. So how about that Mega Drive version then? Well, Shadow the Beast is quite a peculiar Mega Drive release in that there are actually two very distinct versions of the game. The first version is the most common and was released worldwide. The game plays almost identically to the original, but thankfully loading screens have been removed so your progress is never interrupted. The graphics have taken a small hit due to the colour palette being a tad more limited in comparison to the original Amiga release, and there aren't as many layers of parallax scrolling backgrounds, but it's still an impressive effect. The real change is the most noticeable: the soundtrack. The Mega Drive sound chip simply can't cope with the high quality samples of the original, and tracks with heavy synths like the one featured inside the tree are not very pleasant on the ear. The soundtrack also suffers from not being correctly optimised, which means the entire thing plays far too fast. Now let's move on to the second Mega Drive release of Shadow the Beast. This version is far more superior, but sadly it never made it out of Japan. The second port of Shadow the Beast comes with some changes to the game's art to be a little bit more detailed, and it's a better looking game for it. Also added are more difficulty settings to help gamers who were struggling with the original version of the game, which is synonymous for being very unforgiving. But what about that music? Well, sadly the instrumentation has not been changed with this port, but thankfully the speed of the music has been correctly optimised, which makes for a far more authentic experience. So who comes out on top? Shadow the Beast on Mega Drive is definitely a competent port, and the second Japan-only release is an infinitely more desirable version than the sloppier worldwide release. However, despite removing any mid-game loading, the game simply doesn't match the scope of the original Amiga release, which is prettier to look at and sounds amazing even to this day. Sorry Mega Drive, but you lose this round. Join us again next time where we take another look at a game released for both a Sega console and another machine to weigh out which version is more worthy of your time. I've been Sonic Yoda, and you've been watching the Sega Driven YouTube channel. Bye bye!